With chapter 14, Matthew begins his fourth section. The section is subdivided into a narration, chapters 14 through 17, and a discourse on the church and discipleship, chapter 18. Chapter 14, the narrative section opens with a description of King Herod's murder of John the Baptist. Since John the Baptist was chosen by God as a transition person between the Old Testament and New Testament, his death signals the end of the Old Testament times and the beginning of New Testament times in the person of Jesus. Later, Jesus clearly indicates the superiority of the New Testament over the Old Testament by telling his disciples that, along with him, they will sit to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. The account of John's death is followed by Jesus miraculously multiplying 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed a crowd of children, women, and 5,000 men. The crowd may have been 15,000 if every man was with his wife and child. An account of this miracle appears in all 4 Gospels. Petrie counters the German Christian rationalist scholar Heinrich Eberhard Gottlieb Paulus, who, from the presupposition that miracles are not possible, claims that food was not miraculously multiplied. Instead, people shared the food they brought with them. This interpretation is an example of eisegesis, which inserts meaning into a text. In contrast, exegesis aims at drawing the author's intended meaning out of a text. The text, as supported by other gospel accounts, claims that the multiplication of food did not occur naturally, but rather supernaturally. An example of support from other gospel accounts is John's account that explicitly states, "Fragrance from the 5 barley loaves filled 12 baskets." We can learn, though, from this gospel miracle to share, since Jesus has shared with us his supernatural abundance, to knit us more closely as a supernaturally based family which gathers in the celebration of the Eucharist to break and share bread that is transformed into the eternal, life-giving bread of Jesus' body, blood, soul, and divinity. With this miracle, comments Bergsma, Jesus fulfills Ezekiel's prophecy of a divine shepherd who will feed his sheep on the mountains of Israel. Ezekiel 34, 13 through 14. The 12 baskets of fragments further indicate this, since the number of 12 corresponds to the 12 tribes of Israel. The miraculous feeding of the 5,000 with 5 barley loaves is similar, comments Petrie, to Elisha's miraculous feeding of 100 men with 20 loaves of barley, 2 Kings 4:42. Elisha was the successor to Elijah, who was given a double share of Elijah's spirit, signifying that Elisha was spiritually Elijah's eldest son, entitled to a double share of what his father owned. 2 Kings 2:9 and Deuteronomy 21:17. As Elisha's ministry, including his miracles, surpassed Elijah's miracles, so Jesus' ministry surpasses John the Baptist and all the Old Testament prophets' ministry. The miraculous multiplication of the loaves and fish is followed by an account of Jesus walking on the water at night toward his disciples. The Old Testament background of this miracle, comments Hahn, is Daniel chapter 7. In chapter 7, Daniel sees a heavenly being that looks like a son of man riding on clouds of heaven, signifying his divine origin and being presented before the Ancient of Days, a term for God. This divine being is given an everlasting kingdom, which will not pass away. In establishing his kingdom, 4 beasts that have risen from the sea are destroyed. Matthew's reference to the 4th watch of the night, when Jesus walks on the sea waters towards his disciples, corresponds to the defeat of Daniel's 4th and final beast. The 4th watch of the night is also a reference to a specific time, the last of the 4 3-hour periods, roughly between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. By having the power to walk over the sea, or literally on the sea, and calm the wind and the water, Jesus revealed that he, like Daniel's son of man, has a human nature, but is also divine. Seeing Jesus, the disciples think they're seeing a ghost. In quelling his disciples' fear, Jesus also affirmed his divinity with the words, "It is I," Matthew 14:27. The original Greek, explains Petrie, is ego eimi, which is the same expression God uses to identify himself when Moses asked God what his name is, Exodus 3:14. Peter responds to Jesus walking on the water by asking Jesus, "Lord, if it is you, bid me come to you on the water," Matthew 14:28. After hearing Jesus say, "Come," Peter walks towards Jesus, but shortly before reaching Jesus, Peter becomes afraid, and Jesus reaches out his hand to save Peter, saying, "O man of little faith, why did you doubt?" Matthew 14:30. And explaining why Peter sank in the water, Father Menard writes, "Why did Peter sink in the waters? Because of his faith, not because of his lack of faith. He sank because firstly he had faith to cast himself into the water, because he had faith in a word of the Lord, because he had faith to follow Jesus. The other apostles who stayed in the ship with Jesus never sank in the sea because they never threw themselves into it." On another occasion, Peter denied the Lord because he had the courage to follow him, and he did not flee from his house like the other disciples. In this story, the faith of Peter is manifested more clearly than the doubt of Peter. Generally, the lack of Peter's faith is emphasized. Nevertheless, he had much more faith than lack of it. Too much is said about his sinking in the waters, and very little is said about the great stretch of water he walked over. If Peter sank when he was only 1 meter from Jesus, he walked 39 meters over some stormy and violent waters. All who follow Jesus will sink in the sea sometime, but this will only be to be able to return to confide in the saving hand of Jesus and to abandon oneself more completely in him. This passage synthesizes formidably what it is to be a disciple. He or she who asks to be called by Jesus, because to be a disciple does not depend on human initiative nor will, but in one word of Jesus which says, "Come." Nobody can go to Jesus if he at first does not call him or her. He or she who listens to the word, believes in it, and jumps from the ship to go to Jesus. The disciple is not one who never sinks, but one who always returns to confide. He who, on the other hand, recognizes the lordship of Jesus, and on the other hand, the real necessity to be saved. He or she who is corrected by Jesus. End of quote. If Peter, comments Hahn, and I quote, "is a man of little faith, that means we are men of practically none." End of quote. For this reason, it is fitting that the bark of Peter, which the disciples' boat represents, is directed by the successor of Peter, the Pope, whose role is to strengthen his brethren. In accordance with the positive interpretation of Jesus' words to Peter when Peter begins to sink, Father Michael White describes Jesus' words as a form of encouragement, I quote, "by the best of coaches who wants those he oversees to succeed." In other words, Jesus was saying to Peter, "Why did you doubt? You almost made it. You can do this. Rely on me, trust in me, focus on me." Upon witnessing Peter being rescued by Jesus, the disciples in the boat fall down and worship and exclaim, "Truly, you are the Son of God," an expression that the Old Testament uses to refer to the Davidic king of Israel, but in this context, comments Petrie, the expression is intended to be more than that, especially since the words are accompanied by an act of worship properly only to God. The Greek word that describes this act of worship is prosekenesen, which literally means towards, pros, and kiss, kaneo. The Greek word is used because an important gesture for worshiping God is to fall face down, prostrate on the ground. Jesus accepts this act of worship that is directed only to God, an action that Jesus denies the devil when the devil tempts Jesus to worship him. And Jesus responded by quoting Deuteronomy, "You shall worship proskeneses, the Lord your God, and him alone only shall you serve." Chapter 14 concludes with Jesus crossing the Sea of Galilee with his disciples and landing at Gennesaret, At Gennesaret, Jesus heals the sick who are brought to him. People were healed even by simply touching the fringe of his garment.